Hey guys, tonight we're sitting in a waiting room. Not any specific waiting room, but the universal waiting room, that strange, liminal space that exists in Dr. S offices, and DMVs, and auto repair shops, and everywhere humans are asked to pause their lives and simply wait. That place where time moves differently, where the magazines are always from 2003, where you're neither here nor there, just suspended in the peculiar purgatory of anticipation. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you re-watching from and what time it is. I love seeing where these stories find you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. There's something universally strange about waiting rooms. You've been in hundreds of them, different locations, different purposes, different decor, but they all share this peculiar quality of making you feel drowsy, detached, suspended. Your eyelids get heavy, your body settles into the uncomfortable chair. Time becomes elastic, stretching and compressing in ways that make no sense. And somehow, despite being anxious about whatever appointment you're waiting for, you find yourself fighting the urge to fall asleep. Why do waiting rooms do this to us? Why does this specific type of space have this specific effect on human consciousness? The answer is more interesting than you might think, involving psychology, neurology, architecture, and the strange relationship humans have with enforced passivity. Some psychologists argue that waiting rooms trigger what is called situational drowsiness, a state induced not by lack of sleep, but by environmental factors that signal to your brain that nothing is required of you right now. You can't leave, you have an appointment. You can't do much, the space isn't designed for productivity. You can't control the timeline, someone else will call you when it's time. Your brain responds to this enforced passivity by downshifting into a lower energy state, conserving resources for when action is again required. Here's a curious thing about waiting rooms. They're designed to be boring. Not intentionally boring in a malicious way, but boring in a practical way. The decor is neutral, inoffensive, bland. The colors are usually muted, beiges and grays and soft blues. The furniture is functional, but not comfortable enough to really settle into. The magazines are outdated and usually about topics you don't care about. Everything about the space screams, this is temporary. Don't get too comfortable, but also, you're stuck here, so you might as well relax. Your brain processes this environmental information and essentially goes, oh, we're in standby mode. It's like your consciousness shifts from active engagement to passive waiting, from doing to being in limbo. And in that shift, drowsiness creeps in, because what else is your brain supposed to do? You've been removed from the normal flow of your day, placed in this neutral space, given nothing to engage with, and told to wait for an indeterminate amount of time. The waiting room is a liminal space, a threshold, a between place, neither here nor there. Not quite in your regular life. You've left work or home to come here. But you not yet in the appointment or procedure that is coming, that's still in the future, undefined, approaching. You're suspended in this in-between, and human consciousness doesn't handle in-between very well. We're built for action or rest, for engagement or sleep. We're not really built for enforced waiting. Some anthropologists study liminal spaces and find that across cultures, thresholds and in-between places have always had special significance, often associated with transformation, uncertainty, and altered states of consciousness. Waiting rooms are our modern liminal spaces, the thresholds we cross between regular life and medical care, between driving and car repair, between freedom and bureaucratic processing. You've probably noticed that time moves strangely in waiting rooms. You glance at the clock, to 15 p.m. You sit, you wait, you look at a magazine without really reading it. You glance at the clock again, 2:17 p.m. Somehow only 2 minutes have passed when it felt like 20. Or the opposite happens. You zone out completely and suddenly 30 minutes have vanished and you have no idea where they went. This temporal distortion happens because you have no activities to mark time's passage. Normally, your day is punctuated by tasks, actions, changes in environment. You do things, and those things create temporal markers that help you track time's flow. But in a waiting room, you're doing nothing. Time becomes unmarked, undifferentiated, and your brain loses its usual methods for tracking duration. Minutes become hours. Hours become minutes. Time becomes soup. Here's a curious thing about boredom and drowsiness. They're closely linked neurologically. The brain regions that register boredom overlap significantly with those that regulate arousal and wakefulness. When you're bored, your arousal system downregulates, trying to conserve energy in the absence of interesting stimuli. But downregulated arousal looks a lot like pre-sleep drowsiness. Boredom and sleepiness are cousins, maybe even siblings, sharing neural machinery. The chairs in waiting rooms are specifically uncomfortable in interesting ways, not painful uncomfortable that would cause complaints, but uncomfortable enough that you can't quite settle in, can't quite find a position that feels natural. Your body is subtly stressed by the chair, but not stressed enough to stay alert. You're in this weird middle zone, not comfortable enough to relax fully, not uncomfortable enough to stay sharply awake. It's the perfect recipe for drowsy limbo. And the lighting. Waiting room lighting is almost always fluorescent, overhead, institutional. It's bright enough that you're not in darkness, but it lacks the dynamic quality of natural light. There are no shadows changing, no sunbeams moving across the floor, no visual interest whatsoever. Your visual system, finding nothing interesting to process, essentially idles. And an idling visual system contributes to overall drowsiness. Your brain notices that nothing visually interesting is happening and reduces its alert state accordingly. The sounds of waiting rooms are equally soporific. Usually there's some kind of white noise, air conditioning, humming, muffled conversations from behind closed doors, maybe music playing at very low volume, occasionally the rustle of someone turning a magazine page or shifting in their seat. Nothing loud enough to be startling, nothing interesting enough to capture attention. Just a neutral soundscape that fills the space without stimulating your auditory system. Some acoustic researchers study the effect of ambient sound on consciousness and find that low-level, non-patterned sound like HVAC noise actually promotes drowsiness by providing consistent auditory input that doesn't require processing. It is similar to white noise machines used for sleep. The sound masks other potential disturbances, while also giving your auditory cortex something to do that doesn't require attention or alert response. Your body is also probably slightly too warm in the waiting room. Most public spaces are kept slightly warmer than ideal to prevent complaints about being cold. But slight warmth triggers drowsiness. It's part of your body's natural sleep initiation process. As you prepare for sleep, your core temperature drops slightly, but your extremities warm up. Waiting rooms kept at P-74 degrees Fahrenheit trigger that warming sensation, subtly cueing your sleep systems that conditions are right for drowsiness. And then there's the enforced inactivity. You're sitting still, possibly for the first time all day. Your body, which has been in motion, suddenly stops. And stopping after movement tends to induce a crash in energy, a sudden awareness of accumulated fatigue. The waiting room forces you to stop, to sit, to be still. And your body responds with, "Oh, we're stopping. Okay, then I'm tired." The contrast between motion and stillness makes the stillness feel extra soporific. Here's a curious thing about anticipatory anxiety and drowsiness. They can coexist. You might be nervous about the upcoming appointment, worried about what the doctor will say, anxious about the procedure, stressed about the potential news. But the waiting room environment is so strongly soporific that even while anxious, you feel drowsy. Your sympathetic nervous system, anxiety, alertness, and parasympathetic nervous system relaxation, drowsiness, are both activated, creating this weird hybrid state, anxiously sleepy, nervously drowsy, worried, but unable to stay awake. The social dynamics of waiting rooms also contribute. There's an unspoken rule: no talking to strangers, minimal eye contact, everyone in their own bubble. You're surrounded by people, but socially isolated, which removes another potential source of stimulation. If you could chat with fellow waiters, that might keep you alert. But the social contract of waiting rooms demands polite silence. So you sit in your bubble, unstimulated, drowsing. You are, essentially, in the perfect storm of soporific conditions: boring environment, uncomfortable seating, neutral colors, white noise, slight warmth, enforced stillness, social isolation, temporal distortion, and nothing to do. Your brain, encountering all these factors simultaneously, does the only sensible thing. It starts preparing for sleep, because what else would you do in this situation? And you breathe, suspended in the drowsy limbo of waiting. Let's talk about the intentional design of waiting room boredom, because it's not accidental. Waiting rooms are carefully constructed to be exactly this: boring, this neutral, this unstaying. Every beige wall, every generic landscape painting, every outdated magazine has been chosen, or more accurately, not chosen, defaulted to create an environment that offends no one and interests no one. Think about the color palette: beige, gray, soft blue, muted green. These aren't exciting colors. They're not stimulating colors. They're the visual equivalent of elevator music, present but forgettable. There but not there, filling space without creating reaction. The walls in waiting rooms could be any color, but they're almost universally these same neutral shades. Some environmental psychologists study color and arousal levels, finding that bright, saturated colors, reds, oranges, bright yellows, increase alertness and even heart rate slightly. Cool, desaturated colors, the beiges and soft blues of waiting rooms, do the opposite. They calm, they soothe, they lower arousal. Waiting rooms use calming colors not to help you, but to prevent agitation, to keep waiting patients subdued, to minimize the risk of restlessness turning into complaint or conflict. Here's a curious thing about waiting room art. It's aggressively inoffensive. Usually it's generic landscapes, sometimes abstract shapes, occasionally motivational posters with words like patience or serenity superimposed over images of sunsets or mountains. Nothing controversial, nothing interesting, nothing that might spark thought or conversation or any kind of emotional response beyond yes. That is indeed a picture of a tree. This art serves a function, though. It gives your eyes something to land on, preventing the room from feeling completely sterile. but it's carefully chosen to provide minimal stimulation, enough visual interest to prevent complaints about bare walls, not enough to actually engage your visual cortex in any meaningful way. It's decoration as sedation, art as anesthetic. The magazines in waiting rooms are their own special category of blandness. They're always outdated, sometimes by months, sometimes by years. You'll find a National Geographic from 2019, a People magazine from before you can remember, a Women's Health from an era when the fitness trends were completely different. The topics are always generic. 10 tips for better sleep, ironic, given where you are. Celebrity couples, then and now, Mediterranean recipes for heart health. Some researchers study why waiting rooms have such outdated magazines and conclude it's partly budget, new magazines cost money, partly negligence, no one's job it is to update them, but also partly functional. Old magazines are perfect for waiting rooms because you've probably already read them, or at least the topics are familiar enough that you can skim without getting invested. A current magazine might actually engage you, might make time pass interestingly. An old magazine provides something to do without providing actual engagement. You pick up the magazine, flip through it with that particular waiting room reading style, not really reading, just moving your eyes across words, looking at pictures, occasionally pausing on a headline but not committing to the article. It's reading like behavior without actual reading, activity without engagement, doing something without actually doing anything. Perfect for a waiting room, perfect for inducing drowsiness. Here's a curious thing about the furniture. Waiting room chairs are marvels of uncomfortable efficiency. They're not soft enough to sink into, not hard enough to keep you alert through discomfort. The arms are at weird heights that never quite work for resting your arms naturally. The back support is there, but minimal, enough to prevent slouching, but not enough to feel truly supported. You shift position constantly, trying to find comfort that doesn't exist. And each shift uses just enough energy to keep you from getting truly comfortable, but not enough to keep you alert. The spacing of chairs is also carefully weird. Too close together would make you feel crowded, anxious about personal space invasion. Too far apart would feel oddly isolating. The spacing is calibrated to be just right for maintaining the illusion of privacy while reminding you that you're in a shared public space. You're alone together, isolated in proximity, maintaining bubbles that touch but don't overlap. Some architects study waiting room design and find that the goal is usually what they call controlled comfort, making people comfortable enough that they don't complain, but not so comfortable that they settle in for hours. You want patients calm, but not so relaxed that they lose track of time completely. You want them quiet, but not asleep. The design walks this tightrope between comfort and discomfort, between engagement and boredom. The temperature control is another element of the architecture of blandness. It's never too hot, never too cold, always that neutral zone that your body doesn't really register. If it was cold, you'd stay alert, your body working to maintain temperature. If it was warm, you'd get uncomfortable, restless. But at this perfect neutral temperature, your body doesn't have to do anything. Your thermoregulation idles, and an idling body is a drowsy body. The lighting deserves special attention because it's so specifically wrong in interesting ways. Fluorescent overhead lighting is the worst kind of light for maintaining alertness. It lacks the full spectrum of natural light. It doesn't vary in intensity or color temperature throughout the day. It doesn't cast interesting shadows. It's just there, constant, unchanging, institutional. Here, Here's a curious thing about fluorescent lighting and mood. Studies show it can contribute to eye strain, headaches, and general malaise. Your visual system is expecting the dynamic, full-spectrum light of the sun, with its variations and movements and changes. Instead, it gets flat, flickering imperceptibly, but your neurons notice artificial light. Your visual cortex essentially gives up trying to process anything interesting and goes into low-power mode. The windows in waiting rooms, when they exist, are usually high up or facing boring views, parking lots, other buildings, nothing of visual interest. You can't really look out and engage with the outside world. The windows are there to prevent the room from feeling like a tomb, but they're not there to provide connection to the outside world. They're minimally functional, like everything else in this space. Some environmental designers study what they call biophilic design, incorporating natural elements into built environments to improve psychological well-being. Waiting rooms are the opposite of biophilic design. They're almost aggressively divorced from nature, from anything organic or alive or changing. Even if there's a plant, it's usually plastic. Or, if real, it's something hardy and boring, like a pothos vine, barely alive, certainly not thriving. The floor is almost always industrial carpet in a pattern designed to hide stains, usually geometric, usually in shades of blue or gray or beige, busy enough to camouflage dirt, boring enough to not attract attention. Or it's linoleum, easy to clean, cold feeling even when not actually cold. Institutional in that way that reminds you this is a public space, not a home, not somewhere you belong, just somewhere you're temporarily occupying. The walls have motivational posters, as mentioned, but also notices, insurance information, health guidelines, privacy policies, all in small print that no one reads, but everyone is theoretically responsible for knowing. These notices contribute to the visual noise without providing visual interest. They read just more stuff on walls that your eyes glance past without engaging. Here's a curious thing about waiting room acoustics. They're designed for privacy, but achieve boredom. The conversations happening behind doors are muffled enough that you can't make out words, but you can hear that conversations are happening. This creates white noise, sound that fills space without conveying meaning, that masks silence without providing stimulation. Your auditory system has something to process, but nothing to understand, so it idles, contributing to overall drowsiness. The air quality in waiting rooms is another subtle factor. It's not bad air exactly, but it's recycled, filtered, circulated. It lacks the freshness of outdoor air, the variations in scent and temperature that come with natural ventilation. You're breathing sanitized, neutral air, and your olfactory system, which is closely tied to alertness and mood, has nothing interesting to process. No smells means no stimulation, means drowsiness creeps in unopposed. Everything about the architecture of the waiting room, from the beige walls to the uncomfortable chairs to the fluorescent lights to the recycled air, is calibrated to create a specific psychological state: calm, subdued, passive, drowsy. You're not meant to be engaged here. You're meant to wait quietly, bothering no one, making no demands, existing in suspended animation until your name is called. And your brain, encountering this perfectly calibrated environment of blandness, does exactly what it's being asked to do. It powers down, conserves energy, enters standby mode, and prepares for sleep, even though sleep isn't actually appropriate, given that you read in public and have an appointment to attend. and you breathe. Surrounded by calculated beige, time is broken in waiting rooms. Not metaphorically broken, actually, measurably, perceptually broken. The relationship between clock time and experienced time becomes so distorted that you can watch minutes feel like hours, then turn away for what feels like hours and discover only minutes have passed. The waiting room is a temporal anomaly, a pocket universe where time obeys different rules. Think about how you experience time normally. Your day has structure, meetings, meals, tasks, transitions. These activities serve as temporal landmarks, helping your brain construct a coherent sense of time's passage. When you can later recall, I did this, then that, then this, you can estimate how long things took, how much time passed, what the day felt like. But in a waiting room, there are no landmarks. You sit down, you wait, you look at a magazine without reading it. You shift position, you check your phone, you look at the clock, and then what? More sitting, more waiting, more nothing. Your brain has no activities to use as temporal markers, so it loses track, gets confused, estimates wildly. Some psychologists argue that time perception is fundamentally about memory encoding. When you're doing interesting things, creating rich memories, time feels like it passes quickly in the moment, but feels long in retrospect. You remember a lot, so it seems like a lot of time must have passed. When you're bored, creating minimal memories, time feels slow in the moment, but short in retrospect. You remember almost nothing, so it seems like almost no time passed. Here's a curious thing about waiting room time. It combines the worst of both. Time feels slow while you're experiencing it. Every minute crawls. Every glance at the clock reveals that barely any time has passed. But if later someone asks how long were you in the waiting room, you might have no idea. 5 minutes, 30. Time was slow, but also unmemorable, creeping, but also blank, an endless present that left no trace. The clock on the wall becomes both enemy and obsession. You try not to look at it, because looking makes time feel slower. Watched pots never boil, watched clocks never advance. But you can't help looking, compulsively checking, hoping that surely more time has passed than it feels like has passed. And every time you're disappointed. 2 minutes, 3 minutes. Some neuroscientists study the brain's internal clock and find that our time perception is remarkably flexible, influenced by attention, emotion, and environmental factors. When you're anxiously anticipating something like your appointment being called, your attention focuses on time's passage, which paradoxically makes it feel slower. You're hyper-aware of every second, which makes seconds feel longer. The enforced idleness contributes to temporal distortion. When you're active, time passes without you noticing. You look up from work, and suddenly it's been 3 hours. But when you're forced to be idle, with nothing to do and nowhere to go, every moment is noticed, every second registered, and that noticing makes time drag. You're experiencing time rather than being carried by activity through time. Here's a curious thing about anticipation and time. Studies show that anticipating something unpleasant makes time feel longer than anticipating something pleasant. If you're waiting for a vacation to start, time might drag, but with a positive quality. If you're waiting for a potentially scary medical diagnosis, time drags with dread attached, making every moment not just slow, but heavy. The waiting room combines temporal distortion with anticipatory anxiety, creating a particularly unpleasant time experience. Your phone doesn't help as much as you'd think it would. Yes, you can scroll through social media, check emails, play simple games. But you're also distracted by listening for your name to be called, watching for the door to open, maintaining awareness of the waiting room while trying to engage with your phone. This divided attention prevents deep engagement with whatever you're doing, keeping you in that same shallow, drowsy state that characterizes all waiting room consciousness. The magazines definitely don't help. As we discussed, they're too old and too generic to be engaging. But the act of picking one up creates a micro-event, a small temporal marker. First, I was sitting with nothing. Then I picked up the magazine. This might create the illusion that time is passing, that things are happening. But reading the magazine is so unengaging that it actually makes time feel slower. You re-aware, you re-trying to pass time, which makes you aware of time, which makes it crawl. Some researchers study what they call time perspective, the way people relate to past, present, and future. Waiting rooms force you into a hyper-awareness of the present moment, while simultaneously forcing you to anticipate the future. When will I be called? While having nothing to do in the present. You're stuck in a present that feels eternal, anticipating a future that never arrives. Unable to distract yourself with past memories because the present demands too much attention, even though nothing is happening in it. The temporal distortion is worse if you're in pain or discomfort. Physical discomfort grabs attention, makes you hyper-aware of your body, which makes you hyper-aware of each passing moment. Time doesn't just drag, it becomes painful. Each second registered as another second of discomfort continuing. The waiting room becomes not just boring, but torturous, time weaponized against you. Here's a curious thing about waiting and prediction. Your brain constantly tries to predict when your name will be called. It's looking for patterns. The last person waited 15 minutes, so maybe I'll wait 15 minutes. But waiting rooms rarely follow predictable patterns. People have different appointment lengths. Some people are late, disrupting the schedule. Your brain can't find a pattern, can't make accurate predictions, which creates anxiety and makes time feel more uncertain, more chaotic. The checking of your watch or phone becomes compulsive. You look, note the time, tell yourself you won't look again for at least 10 minutes. 3 minutes later, you look again. Why? Because your brain is desperately seeking information about time's passage, trying to impose structure on the structureless experience of waiting. Each check is simultaneously an attempt to assert control and an acknowledgement of having no control. Children are even worse at waiting room time. They lack the developed prefrontal cortex that allows adults to tolerate boredom and delayed gratification. For a child, 5 minutes in a waiting room can feel like torture. They fidget, complain, ask repeatedly, when will it be our turn? Their temporal distortion is even more severe than adults. Their suffering even more acute. Some hospitals have started addressing this by installing what they call distraction interventions, fish tanks, interactive screens, play areas. These provide temporal landmarks, actual things to engage with, which helps time feel more normal. But most waiting rooms remain temporal wastelands, where time goes to die slowly while you watch. And yet, paradoxically, when your name is finally called, you might feel surprised. Wait, already. You've been sitting there for what felt like hours, and simultaneously for no time at all. The temporal distortion is so severe that you've lost all sense of actual duration. Time was both infinite and instantaneous, both crawling and vanished, and you breathe, suspended outside normal time. There's something specifically difficult about passive waiting, about being forced to do nothing while anticipating something. Your brain is built for action. It evolved to hunt, gather, fight, flee, solve problems, accomplish tasks. It did not evolve to sit quietly in beige rooms, doing nothing while waiting for someone else to determine when you can proceed with your day. Think about how active waiting differs from passive waiting. If you're cooking dinner and something needs to bake for 20 minutes, you wait. But you're also doing other things, preparing sides, setting the table, cleaning up. The waiting is filled with activity. Or if you're waiting for a bus, you might read, text, observe people, remain somewhat engaged with the world. You're still in control of how you occupy your wait time. But waiting room waiting is different. You've been removed from your normal environment and placed in this neutral space. You can't really do anything productive. You can't leave. You're not in control of when the waiting ends. Someone else, a nurse, a receptionist, a bureaucrat, holds all the power over your time. You are passive, powerless, at someone else's mercy. Some psychologists argue that this powerlessness triggers a stress response that paradoxically combines with boredom to create that anxious, drowsy state characteristic of waiting rooms. Your sympathetic nervous system activates stress, no control, anticipation, while your parasympathetic system also activates nothing to do, boring environment, time to rest. The systems that usually alternate are both activated simultaneously, creating internal conflict, confusion, and that weird feeling of being simultaneously wired and exhausted. Here's a curious thing about control and stress. Studies show that having control over a stressor dramatically reduces its negative impact. People who can control when an unpleasant stimulus occurs tolerate it much better than people who have no control. Waiting rooms remove all control. You can't control when you're seen. Can't control how long you wait. Uneven really control your own attention because you have to maintain enough awareness to respond when called. The passive waiting also triggers what psychologists call learned helplessness in miniature. You try to manage your time, read a magazine, check your phone, shift position, but none of these activities actually help. The waiting continues regardless. Eventually, your brain learns that nothing you do matters, that you're helpless to affect the situation, so it stops trying, conserves energy, becomes passive. This passivity feels like drowsiness because passivity and drowsiness share neural pathways. Some researchers study the difference between active and passive coping strategies. Active coping involves doing something to change your situation. Passive coping involves adjusting your internal state to tolerate an unchangeable situation. Waiting rooms force passive coping. You can't change the situation, can only adjust your internal state. And one way to adjust internal state to tolerate boring, powerless situations is to become drowsy, disconnected, mentally checked out. The anticipation component is its own special kind of stress. You're waiting for your name to be called, which could happen any moment, which means you have to maintain some level of alertness. But it probably won't happen in the next minute or the next. So maintaining high alertness is exhausting and futile. Your brain cycles between vigilance, what if they call me and I don't hear, and exhaustion, but they probably won't call yet, so I can rest a bit. This cycling is mentally fatiguing. Here's a curious thing about anticipatory anxiety. It's often worse than the actual feared event. People spend hours worrying about a dental appointment that lasts 30 minutes. The waiting and anticipating are more stressful than the actual experience. Waiting rooms capitalize on, or maybe inadvertently, create this phenomenon. The space itself generates more anxiety than whatever you waiting for, but in such a boring way that the anxiety manifests as drowsiness rather than panic. The social dynamics of passive waiting are also interesting. You're surrounded by people who are also waiting, also powerless, also bored. But the social contract prevents connection. You can't really talk to them. That would be weird, would violate waiting room norms. You can't ignore them completely. They're right there in your peripheral vision. So you exist in this strange middle state, aware of others but not connecting with them, alone but not alone, isolated in proximity. Some sociologists study what they call civil inattention, the way strangers in public spaces acknowledge each other's presence while also respecting each other's privacy and personal space. Waiting rooms require intense civil inattention, everyone pretending everyone else doesn't exist, everyone maintaining bubbles, everyone alone together. This social navigation requires cognitive resources, which is exhausting, which contributes to drowsiness. The passivity of waiting also means you're not using your body. You're sitting still for extended periods, which alone can trigger drowsiness. Your muscles aren't being used. Your cardiovascular system isn't being challenged. Your body, finding no physical demands being made, powers down, conserves energy, becomes sluggish. The stillness that's enforced becomes the stillness of near sleep. Here's a curious thing about enforced inactivity. It's actually stressful for humans. We're built to move. Contemporary humans sit too much anyway, and being forced to sit even more in uncomfortable chairs with nothing to do creates a kind of physical frustration that manifests as both restlessness, constant position shifting, and drowsiness, body giving up on activity entirely. Your mind starts to wander in particular ways during passive waiting. You can't really focus deeply on anything because you might be called at any moment. So your mind enters what psychologists call mind-wandering or default mode network activation, that state where you're not thinking about anything specific, just drifting from thought to thought, slightly dissociated from your immediate environment, existing more internally than externally. Some neuroscientists study mind-wandering and find that it's associated with increased activity in certain brain regions and decreased activity in others. It's not quite awakened focused, not quite dreaming, but somewhere in between, a state that naturally occurs when we're unstimulated, that feels a lot like the drowsy drift toward sleep. Waiting rooms essentially force your brain into prolonged mind-wandering, which feels like, and often becomes, actual drowsiness. The powerlessness also makes time feel less valuable somehow. When you're in control of your time, every minute matters. But when you're passive, waiting for someone else to release you back to your day, time becomes this weird, abstract thing that passes without being used. Your brain notices this devaluing of time and responds by caring less about remaining alert. If time doesn't matter, why stay awake? Why not just drift? And so you sit, passive and drowsy, waiting for someone to call your name, surrendering to the enforced uselessness of your time, conserving energy for when you'll be returned to agency, to control, to the active life you'll resume once this strange interlude of waiting is finally over and you breathe, passively, softly, almost sleeping. Let's examine more closely the strange artifacts that populate waiting rooms, the magazines. These aren't just reading material, they're temporal artifacts, archaeological evidence of a time when someone last bothered to update the reading selection. and they serve a very specific psychological function in the ecosystem of waiting room drowsiness. You reach for a magazine, maybe People from 2017, maybe a health magazine from 2019, maybe a car magazine you have zero interest in, but it's there, and you need something to do with your hands. The cover promises 15 tips for better organization and celebrity weddings. And you know, even before opening it, that you won't actually read any of these articles, but you pick it up anyway. The act of picking up the magazine is itself a small rebellion against enforced passivity. Your hands have something to hold. Your eyes have something to track across pages. You're doing something, even if that something is utterly meaningless. It's the illusion of occupation, the performance of being engaged when actually you're just moving your eyes across words without processing them. Some psychologists study what they call pseudo-reading, the act of moving eyes across text without comprehension, creating the appearance of reading without the cognitive engagement of actual reading. Waiting room magazine perusal is almost always pseudo-reading. You're pantomiming literacy while your mind drifts elsewhere, maintaining just enough attention to turn pages at plausible intervals. Here's a curious thing about old magazines: they're weirdly comforting. Current magazines might actually engage you, might contain information you'd want to remember or share. But a magazine from 5 years ago, you can read it, guilt-free, knowing nothing in it matters anymore. Those celebrity couples probably broke up. Those health trends have been replaced. That political analysis is hilariously outdated. The magazine's irrelevance gives you permission to engage with it carelessly, which is exactly the right energy for waiting room consciousness. The topics are always the same: health, celebrity gossip, home decoration, travel destinations, recipes you'll never make, workout routines you'll never follow. These topics require no prior knowledge, no sustained attention, no intellectual investment. You can drop in and out, read 3 sentences of one article, flip to another, look at pictures, never finish anything, and that's completely acceptable. The magazine expects nothing from you. Some media researchers study skimmable content and find that certain types of writing are specifically designed for low-attention environments. Waiting room magazines exemplify this. Short paragraphs, lots of headers, attractive photos, minimal depth. Every article can be understood from its title and first paragraph. Reading further is optional and usually unrewarding. The content is designed to be consumed with minimal cognitive effort. The physical act of flipping pages is itself soporific. There's a rhythm to it: flip, scan, that becomes almost meditative. Your hands have a task, your eyes track movement. Your brain enters a low-level pattern of behavior that requires no decisions, no analysis, no engagement. It's like counting sheep, repetitive, meaningless, surprisingly effective at inducing drowsiness. Here's a curious thing about tactile engagement and boredom. Studies show that giving people something to manipulate with their hands can reduce perceived boredom, even if the manipulation is pointless. The magazine provides tactile feedback: the feel of paper, the slight resistance of pages turning, the weight of the magazine in your hands. This tactile input gives your sensory system something to process, even though it's not interesting enough to keep you alert. You might read the same paragraph 3 times without realizing it, your eyes tracking the words while your mind is completely elsewhere. Then you'll realize you've been pseudo-reading for 5 minutes without processing a single sentence. And you'll feel that disorientation of having lost time. of not quite knowing where you've been mentally, of existing in a fog of almost attention. The advertisements are their own category of waiting room archaeology. Companies that no longer exist, products that have been discontinued, prices that seem hilariously low by current standards. The ads are windows into a recent but distinctly past world, and looking at them creates a strange temporal vertigo. This wasn't long ago, but it feels like another era entirely. Some cultural anthropologists study ephemeral media, like old magazines, and find they reveal fascinating information about the cultural moment they were created in. What was considered important, beautiful, worth advertising. But in a waiting room, you're probably not analyzing them that deeply. You're just noticing, vaguely, that everything feels slightly off, slightly outdated, slightly wrong in ways that contribute to the overall sense of being suspended outside normal time. The magazine also serves as a socially acceptable face barrier. If you're holding a magazine, you're occupied, and other people won't try to talk to you. It signals, I'm doing something even though you're not really doing anything. It provides plausible deniability for your thousand-yard stare, your glazed eyes, your complete mental absence from the waiting room. I'm not zoned out, I'm reading, even though you're definitely zoned out. Here's a curious thing about props and social performance. Sociologists study how people use objects to manage social situations and present desired identities. The Waiting Room magazine is a prop in your performance of patient waiting patiently. You read demonstrating appropriate behavior, showing that you're occupied and content, even though internally you're bored, anxious, and fighting drowsiness. Eventually, you set the magazine down, having read nothing, having learned nothing, having accomplished nothing, except filling 5 or 10 minutes with the appearance of activity, and immediately you feel the drowsiness return more strongly, as if the magazine was providing just enough stimulation to keep you from fully succumbing to sleep. And now that it's gone, nothing stands between you and the soporific pull of the waiting room environment. You might pick up another magazine, repeating the cycle, or you might surrender to the drowsiness, letting your eyes close, your head nod forward, entering that micro-sleep state where you're not quite asleep, but definitely not awake, existing in the gray zone between consciousness and unconsciousness that waiting rooms seem specifically designed to induce, and you breathe, turning pages in your sleep. The social dynamics of waiting rooms deserve their own examination because they're so specifically weird. You're in a room with other humans, sometimes many other humans, and yet you're all pretending each other don't exist. This enforced isolation in proximity contributes significantly to the drowsy detachment of waiting room consciousness. Think about normal social situations. When you're in an elevator, you might exchange brief greetings, acknowledge each other's humanity for a moment before returning to polite silence. When you're in line at a store, you might chat with the person next to you about the wait, the weather, whatever. But waiting rooms have stricter rules: no talking, no eye contact beyond the briefest acknowledgement. Everyone in their bubble. Some anthropologists study these unwritten social codes and find that waiting rooms have particularly strong norms around non-interaction, perhaps because the space is medical or bureaucratic, inherently private, despite being public. Perhaps because everyone is anxious about their own appointment and doesn't have emotional bandwidth for social engagement. Whatever the reason, the rule is clear. We don't talk here. Here's a curious thing about social isolation and arousal. Being around other people typically keeps us alert. Social interaction, even minimal interaction, activates certain brain systems that promote wakefulness. But when we're around others, yet prevented from interacting, we get the worst of both worlds. The cognitive load of managing social presence without the arousal benefits of actual social engagement. You're aware of the other people in ways that require mental resources. You notice when someone new enters, when someone gets called back, when someone shifts position, or coughs, or sighs. Each of these events momentarily activates your attention, pulls you slightly out of drowsiness, then immediately releases you back to boredom when the event proves irrelevant to you. It's like being repeatedly woken from light sleep without ever being allowed to fully wake. The positioning of chairs forces you into each other's peripheral vision. You can't quite ignore each other completely, but you're also working hard to pretend you're not aware of each other. This paradox, noticing while pretending not to notice, being aware while performing unawareness, is cognitively exhausting in subtle ways that contribute to mental fatigue. Some psychologists study what they call social monitoring, the constant low-level attention we pay to other people as behavior in shared spaces. This monitoring typically happens automatically, outside conscious awareness, but it still requires neural resources. In a waiting room, you're monitoring others. Are they getting restless? Might they be called before you? Are they sick and contagious? While also trying to appear uninterested in them. The monitoring plus the performance of not monitoring creates significant cognitive load. Here's a curious thing about shared spaces and emotional contagion. Emotions are contagious. If someone in the waiting room is anxious, their anxiety subtly affects others. If someone is drowsy, their drowsiness spreads. You pick up on tiny behavioral cues, posture, breathing patterns, facial expressions, and your nervous system mirrors them without conscious decision. So the waiting room becomes an echo chamber of shared, drowsy anxiety, everyone making everyone else slightly more drowsy and slightly more anxious. The silence itself is a presence, not an absence. It's not peaceful silence, like a library or meditative space. It's tense silence, silence maintained through effort, silence that could break at any moment if someone violates the norm. This tension, paradoxically, contributes to exhaustion. You're using energy to maintain the silence, to not interact, to stay in your bubble. Children violate these norms constantly, and their violations create tiny dramas. A child talks loudly, and the parent shushes them. A child approaches another child, and the parents intervene, redirecting them back to their seats. A child cries or whines, and everyone pretends not to notice, while definitely noticing. These violations and corrections reinforce the norms, while also briefly breaking the monotony, creating tiny spikes in the room's energy level that quickly dissipate back to drowsy silence. Some researchers study civil inattention in medical settings specifically and find it serves important functions. It protects privacy, reduces anxiety about being observed, maintains dignity when people feel vulnerable, but it also isolates, prevents potential connection or mutual support, and contributes to the sense of being alone despite being surrounded by others. The waiting might feel less interminable if you could chat with fellow waiters, share complaints, commiserate about the slowness, but the social contract forbids it. So you suffer alone together, each person carrying their own anxiety and boredom in isolation, prevented from the kind of social connection that might make the wait more tolerable. Here's a curious thing about shared experience and bonding. Humans typically bond over shared, difficult experiences. But waiting rooms prevent this bonding. Everyone is having the same difficult experience, waiting, bored, anxious, but the social norms prevent acknowledging it, prevent using it as basis for connection. The shared experience remains unchanged. Occasionally, someone breaks the rules. Maybe an elderly person strikes up conversation with you about the wait, about their health, about the weather. And for a moment, the waiting room feels different, less isolating, less drowsy, almost human. But then the conversation ends, and you both return to your bubbles, and the silence reasserts itself, and the drowsiness that had lifted slightly comes flooding back. The social performance required by waiting rooms, appearing patient, appearing content, maintaining your bubble, not interacting with skill and consistency, is a form of emotional labor. You're managing your presentation, controlling your expression of boredom or anxiety, maintaining the fiction that you're fine with this situation. Emotional labor is exhausting. Exhaustion manifests as drowsiness. And so you sit, silent among the silent, alone among the alone, performing patience while internally screaming with boredom, too drained by social management to maintain alertness, sinking into the comfortable numbness of disconnection, waiting for your name to finally be called so you can leave this strange social prison and return to a world where interaction is allowed and silence is optional, and you breathe, quietly, so quietly, invisible among others, almost being called, the relief, anxiety of finally hearing your name. Children in waiting rooms, different types of waiting rooms, the staff perspective, cultural differences in waiting, the wisdom of waiting, and a gentle closing about accepting stillness. We've spent this long night exploring every corner of waiting room psychology, the beige walls, the temporal distortions, the drowsy social dynamics, the magazines from 2003. We've examined why these spaces make you so specifically, universally sleepy. And now, as our time together winds down, let's find the gift in waiting. Because here's what's true. Learning to wait patiently is learning to be human. Life is full of waiting, for test results, for decisions, for arrivals and departures, for things to begin and things to end. The waiting room is practice, is training, is your brain learning that not everything happens on your timeline, that sometimes you have to surrender, control, be still, exist in the in-between. And the drowsiness, maybe it's your brain's mercy. When you can't control the situation, when activity is impossible, when all you can do is wait, drowsiness is protection, is escape. Is your nervous system saying, let me help you through this boring, anxious time by turning down the volume on your consciousness? The sleepiness isn't a problem. It's your brain being kind. Tonight, as you lie here, you're not in a waiting room. You're in your bed, in your safe space, with nowhere to be, no appointment pending, no name to be called. But maybe the waiting room has taught you something about stillness, about the space between action, about the value of existing without doing. Your brain hoards memories of waiting, all those hours in beige rooms, all that drowsy detachment, all those ancient magazines. And those memories serve a purpose. They teach you that boredom isn't dangerous, that stillness isn't failure, that sometimes the most appropriate response to a situation is simply to wait, softly, patiently, maybe a little sleepily. So tonight, give yourself permission to wait for sleep the way you wait in waiting rooms, without forcing, without urgency, just existing in the in-between space where waking becomes sleeping, where consciousness softens into dreams, where you finally get to rest and you breathe, and you wait, and you sleep. The end.